Hi. Wow, you guys are all very far away. I feel like very lonely up here. But you don't need to change. But what I like most, when Laura Frey asked me to do this, she said, bring some friends along. As you might discover, I don't have any friends. But thank you. But I am hopeful that that we have a conversation, right? Like that's all much more interesting. Also, just to let you know, what I'm going to talk about today is actually just what's on my mind from the last 6 months of work I've done. And particularly, I want to talk about a recent transfer I did, moving Hell's Kitchen, the Alicia Keys musical, from Broadway to the First National Tour, which we just finished 3 weeks ago. I can't remember, or 3 days ago, or something like that. But it's actually a fascinating little case study about screens, architecture, and the way the relationship between physical architecture and content and screens functions. And I think I'm busy trying to learn the lessons of building that tour. So I'll get to all that. But first, for those of you who don't know who I am, a little bit about who I am. I'm Peter Negrini. I'm a projection designer. I started doing this before this existed. Like, that's sort of one of the things that's true about my career in the theater, my career as a projection designer, is when I started really projection design in the theater didn't exist. Like the idea of a screens producer, screens direction, like all those things didn't really exist. And so one of the great good fortunes of that for me was that I couldn't study it. I couldn't go to school and learn how to do this. So instead, I went to school and learned other things, which has served me, I think, very, very well for my career. I studied as a set designer, I studied as a lighting designer, I went to the Central St. Martin's College of Art in London and was forced to design costumes, which I shouldn't ever do again, but it was a good learning experience, and I studied art. And that's why I wanted to start with this image, and wanted to talk about it a little bit. This is a painting often called Virgin of the Rocks by Leonardo da Vinci. Painted it in 1883-ish. And what's critical about it, there's 4 figures in it. The Virgin Mary, obviously, a child Jesus on screen left, the infant John the Baptist, and the angel Uriel, right? And this painting, it's sort of often discussed in art history about composition and how we direct gaze. So if you look at this painting, we can look at it a little more closely. You'll notice that every individual in the painting is looking at a different individual, right? So that each person is looking somewhere, and as you spend time looking at this, the gaze of the individuals in the painting directs your eye as a viewer around the painting, right? And this is something, it's very common in high Renaissance art, that there's this complicated relationship of all of the figures' eye lines. And the idea is that you can use those eye lines to control the gaze of the viewer. And it's a sort of big thing that first started happening in the Renaissance. Like before this time in art history, they didn't do that. Like every figure was looking straight out of the canvas and looking at the viewer. And in the Renaissance, this was the time that started happening. The reason I bring that up is I feel that my primary job as a projection designer in the theater is to direct the gaze, right? My responsibility to control where the audience is looking, what their attention is, how they are focused, is this same basic job. How do we create a picture that's not about the content? Obviously the content's important. I believe in content, I believe in all the things it can do. But in the end, the content alone is, in my mind, only a single layer in a composite. I like to think about screens design, projection design, in the same way that you think about building film composites, right? You have you might shoot the foreground, you might have some, which is your performers, you might have some mid-ground scenery, and then you might have, you know, in the olden days, a matte painting at the back. Then you would have a green screen. Now you might have an LED volume and a VR stage. But in any case, in that example, what you're doing is compositing all of these various visual inputs into a single frame. And I think, you know, my sort of big belief is that our job as screens designers is to do the same thing. We need to be composing for the composite picture, not just one fragment of it. And a lot of that is about, as I said, directing gaze. One of the things that I think is key, and I want to get to this sort of cut pretty quickly to my case study for Hell's Kitchen, is very often the answer to that is negative space. Where is there depth in a picture? Where are you allowed to see past a boundary, right? So here's a photograph from Hell's Kitchen. The set for this was furiously complex. It was intentionally multi-layered and a series of fragments composited together on top of each other. When the set designer, Robert Brill, and I first started talking about it and talking with Alicia about what she wanted to capture, what she talked about was what Hell's Kitchen felt like and looked like in the 1990s. And that wasn't about a complete image of anything. It was about that experience you get in Manhattan or other large cities where you're seeing down a street and you see a fragment of a sign and a piece of something else, and then another fragment of a thing beyond. And that idea that the city is being revealed to you in layers, and that it has this sort of like endless depth, and that as you move into that depth, there's a sort of series of surprises and new things to discover in each visual plane. And so our challenge was how to kind of create that vision of what looking crosstown in the 40s in Manhattan looks like on a stage that's only 27 feet deep, and you know, with that sort of limited depth. And a lot of that was about creating this notion of fragments, and that planes interrupt other planes. So what you're seeing here, I mean, if Robert Brill and I have done our job well, you can't actually unpack what is physical and what is not from this photograph. And if we did our job well, even if you go to the theater, you won't quite be able to unpack what all the layers are made of. The set is a series of vertical structures that are sort of perforated steel and steel beams, sort of meant to mimic the rhythm of Manhattan Plaza, which is the apartment complex that Alicia grew up in Hell's Kitchen. All of those things sit in front of a series of LED surfaces, some of which track, some of which fly, and the composition of which could constantly be changed. And let me show you I'll give you a sort of little more about what those might look like. This is a storyboard frame of the production, where you can see where it says Manhattan Plaza across the top is it's like a half meter tall by 6 meter wide LED surface. This sort of area just below that, there was a 4 by 6 meter flying piece. Then there was a 6 meter by, no, 4 meter by 8 meter tall piece that would track back and forth. All of that sort of upstage LED surfaces would all move. Here I sort of tried to call them out. I'm going to stand up and, sorry for the people at home, but you can see like this is one surface that would fly. This is another surface that would fly. This piece would track back and forth. These were permanent pieces farther upstage. So that all of these pieces were constantly reconfiguring themselves and making these sort of little black holes, right? And those would see through to the depth, the full depth of the theater. This was all relatively far upstage. What was interesting about this as a tool and what came out of designing it with Robert was that it created for us a series, a kind of constant visual puzzle. We were sort of constantly saying, okay, we have this limited palette. How do we reconfigure these objects to compose an image? How do we reconfigure these things and design content for them to create a picture that has multiple layers and sort of with image in multiple depths? And one of the things that I feel is like a key to being a great projection designer is having a good set to work with. Like I often feel like if I haven't got my hands in and collaborated with the set designer to get the right foundation for my work, then I'm in a world of trouble. It worked out, but like unlike this, where there's a sort of series of obstructions, like the screens are all sort of various shapes, and there are holes in them and things like that. I just finished designing Chess that's going to open next week at the Imperial, and it has just a big flat LED sheet, and that is so much harder because all of a sudden there's no innate architecture to the room, right? Like every architectural requirement was placed on me. And then I sort of need to come in and say, okay, I need to make a set of constraints. So in that case, the physical scenery doesn't constrain my aesthetic choices. It's the only thing constraining my choices are what I choose to do with content. Whereas what was interesting in Hell's Kitchen is the reality of the set, what was we designed as physical objects, created a constraint to begin with. And that sort of limitation is key. Like I said, I wanted to talk about what I've been thinking about. And what we've just done is taken this set and transferred it to the tour. The economic realities of touring are that there's no way we're traveling with that much automation. Loading in, an additional 6 points of automation upstage on a First National tour where they have 8 hours to put it in doesn't happen. Like it's not the world we live in. However, loading in a really big flat LED wall is economically viable. So what we did was reduce that entire upstage surface, all the various planes and objects that are the upstage surface for Hell's Kitchen, we reduced them into a single flat LED wall. And then proceeded. Ben Kitely, who's a great disguise programmer, proceeded to basically simulate all the automation programming and move all the objects around this single flat LED sheet as if the real objects existed. Originally all the LED was hanging on truss. We did a simulation of all the truss. We simulated all the backlight highlightation on the glints on the edge of the truss. We simulated the lift lines of all the LEDs panels that had previously been flying. And in doing that, we were able to essentially recreate what we did at the Shubert on a flat screen. And it works surprisingly well. Like, I dare the average audience to know the difference. Which then raises the question, why did we spend so much money and so much time loading in all of this automation into the Schubert to do something that we could simply do on a flat LED wall that doesn't move? And that then, why I've said this is what I'm interested in about, is the problem is I wouldn't have designed the same show. Like, without those constraints, without these set of physical limitations and the sort of commensurate opportunities, I wouldn't have done it. And so the puzzle that I'm sort of trying to figure out is how can I, as a designer, work in such a way that even if we are going to do a lot of this stuff virtually, if we are going to simulate scenery, which is increasingly viable and has a whole world of opportunities in it, not just economic opportunities, I think it has visual opportunities. How do we do it in a way that how to say this, like to force ourselves to have the inspiration that those obstacles presented. Like, the scenery was an obstacle. Like, and it was designed to be an obstacle. Like, it was designed to be a physical obstacle that the audience was sort of working to see through, right? That you know, all the way up left, there's this sign from a bodega on 9th Avenue, but we don't want that to be easy to access. We wanted sort of the thing that, oh, you sort of peer through the sort of forest of steel and other objects and you finally see it. So the question that, beyond the sort of technical realities of how we did it, the question I had for myself is, how do I set up a way of working, a process where by allowing a design to become virtual in this way, you don't actually give up the good parts of real scenery, of physical objects, and how you need to interact with them. So that is what I'm sort of busy spending my time thinking about. And one way is to, you know, do the Broadway production and spend a ton of money on automation and then move on. You know, but the other way is, I've been wondering, like, oh, should this collaboration with set designers evolve into one in which we are designing purely virtual environments, right? Where, you know, could if we knew what the end point of this collaboration was, could Robert and I have designed this set, or he designed the set, we designed the set, however you want to think about it, and then simply said, well, those are the constraints. We're going to agree to never break these rules, and then design a show with a flat RP sheet, or a flat, you know, LED wall that will only be used in these particular ways. The danger is, do you have the power of your own conviction, right? Like, that's the worry. And I mean, I'll tell you, while we were taking the tour, did we start cheating? Definitely. Like, there's no question. There was a couple moments of like, oh, wouldn't this be better if we actually put content where the rules, the original design of where there physically could be LED, there could, in that rubric, we couldn't put image there. But now, well, okay, it's all just a giant LED wall, so why don't we do it? And you know, okay, maybe we got away with it. I mean, the context of that was always like, will anyone notice that we've broken the rules? But I think it's a challenge for me as a designer when I look at those obstructions. That can you adhere to those rules long enough to get the aesthetic benefit, right? Because one of the things I often talk about projection design writ large, not just about the collaborations with other designers, is that the problem with designing for screens is that sort of anything is possible. And that's actually a liability. That, the fact that, oh, it could be an image of anything is sort of is a detriment, right? Because it allows us to not be rigorous, right? In the way that we're putting images on stage. What are the rules? I mean, one of the things I just finished on chess is like, oh, it's all just squares. It's really only squares. There's no rectangles. We weren't allowed to put rectangles on stage. Everything had to be a square. It seems pedantic, but it was the rule, right? And yes, I broke it. I'm not going to tell you when. But but those structures, I think, are helpful. But I've gotten off my tangent, or I've gotten off on a tangent about this idea of collaboration, control of light, and how we work with other designers. I've spoken a little bit about scenery. Let me show you a couple more things from Hell's Kitchen, and then we'll do some other things. But just to give you an idea of the sort of the way that we looked at generating depth. One of the other sort of controlling attributes in theater, in any case, is about negative space, right? So that a lot of what drove this design was about when do we not turn things on? When do we allow things to recede into depth? When do we create images that are willfully asymmetrical? Like in this case, that bright piece of sky is very intentionally sort of, again, difficult to get to, difficult to see. And there's an sort of intention behind that. This was a scene for, it's literally about sort of young Allie, AKA Alicia's, sort of experience of attempting to see the river from her apartment in Manhattan Plaza, and the sort of barely accessible slice of sky that she could see. So that, again, sort of finding a way to pile that back there. And that's not something I can do in an image alone. Like it required the physical obstruction, right? And so that in those conversations, long before we were talking about content, we were talking about what is the scenery that we can put in front of the screens? How do we make it hard to see the screens instead of how to make it easy? And the other thing that I think is true, and this next image is a great example of it, is how then when you want to, this is like, oh, this is the flat version. We could assemble the surfaces in such a way that you sort of erase that depth, and all of a sudden you're filling a plane, and you're actually creating a physical back wall to the theater, whereas previously you'd allowed it to have a sort of a vanishing point and a depth that it disappeared to. And so, all those questions on a moment, in the design about controlling space, volume of space, and architecture were critical to the design process and critical to, frankly, a collaboration with a set designer that predated the vast majority of the content. Right? I think that one of the challenges is, as projection designers, we're often, before we begin, we're given a set. Okay, here is the canvas, and now make something for it. And I think that in the theater anyways, that's a flaw in the process, right? And it's something that I work very actively to say, no, that my work needs to begin when the set starts getting designed, and when that creating the opportunity for image and how the images will function is a critical part of my job. And if I've set it up properly, my job gets quite easy. And if it's been set up incorrectly, my job is difficult to impossible. And it does involve getting sometimes rather aggressive about what image requires, in terms of physical space. The other big component of this, and this is about light. That's the other big sort of controller of gaze, right? When we're talking about high Renaissance art and things like that, how our eye casts around the room. This is all things we know. It's what a lighting designer does every day. But one of the things that I think is critical when we're designing content for screens is we can, in a heartbeat, destroy all of the good work that a lighting designer might be doing, because we are, on a good day, collaborators in creating that composition, and in a bad day, we're just the spoilers, right? That we can, with image, particularly, in the good old days when I started, the projectors were not nearly bright enough that I could mess up any lighting designer's picture. That is no longer true with projectors, and certainly not true with LED. And it's a process that I see that I do a lot in the theater, and when I sort of step out of the theater or work with programmers or collaborators who aren't day to day in live or in theater, they're often surprised about the amount of time that I spend shaping an image, the number of sort of variously oval and diagonal gradients in any disguised timeline of any show I've ever designed is endless. That we're constantly just subtly shaping and vignetting and contouring an image, even if we've designed the image. And that's work that has to happen sort of in concert with a lighting design, in concert with like where we are trying to direct the gaze on stage. And often that's work that can't be done in advance. And it's one of the great benefits that I have in the sort of world I work in, where, I might spend 40 days, 45 days sitting in front of a design in the theater with a programmer every single day, maybe 10 hours a day for a month and a half, 6 weeks, 8 weeks maybe. And that's often a luxury that other design in other sort of aspects don't get. To get that much time to sit in front of a design is an incredible luxury, but it does teach things. And a lot of that is about this idea about controlling light and controlling gaze. That's a lot of what I spend my time doing, is saying, where do I want anyone to look at this given moment? And how do I make that a natural thing for them to do, as opposed to something where the focus is in competition between those two designers. I have now talked for 30 minutes, look at that. And I told you that I didn't want this to be a monologue. So I'm gonna break the rules and start asking you guys to ask me questions and talk about things, because that's more interesting for me. Yes?
With lighting, using your single upstage wall to play this,
right.
How much of that have you played with, like real time or collaborating with the lighting team directly, or is it more, like you said, placing masks?
Would you mind repeating for the live stream?
Oh, sure, of course. So the question was, thank you. The question was, when we're talking about shaping space, how much of that is about real time with a lighting designer, and how much of it is us sort of working on our own in response? I think most of it is in response. I do love what is increasingly possible about real-time collaboration with the lighting designers, and using lighting systems to control content. However, I think that is one of the things it's not very good at. Because it's about an eye towards image. So a lot of times, like, oh, the way we're doing that, yes, it's about bringing a gradient, but it's also about saying, oh, should this image be recomposed, right? Like, is the sort of subject of this image in the wrong place, and can we adjust that? That being said, I think there's a great, I'm incredibly excited by sort of those interactions. We just built, for chess, opening number of Act 2, one night in Bangkok, we just built 137 channels of neon signs that were, well, I think it was 137 channels, which was half that many signs, all in a 3D model, output them all as individually controllable layers, stacked it all up into skies, sent a channel list over to the lighting designer, and then we went to the bar and let him cue the blinking neon signs for that number to his heart's content. He loved it. Kevin Adams, he had a great time. But also, his tools are better suited for it, right? Like, if you want, you know, an effects engine and all those other things, it's like perfect. That is what a moving light desk is born to do. And in the meantime, we were still constantly recomposing that and changing that. So those things are incredibly good tools. I think it's also, there are times when we've sort of like, oh, the upstage surface is functioning like a cyc, and we will basically use disguise to, you know, expose an LED surface as a cyc, basically, and give them control over doing that. But I think it has limited utility when it gets to the sort of more nuanced question, because you do want it in its best version to have an interaction with content, right? So it's like, you know, day one, it might be a gradient that's coming in, and by day 3, oh, it's not a gradient, it's, you know, we've repositioned one of those fire escapes so that the image is doing the work instead of something as sort of the brute force of a gradient. Who's got more questions? Yes?
Hey, so at this conference,
Yeah.
I feel like there's been a lot of discussions about how audiences are starting to create like kind of unique like stories and experiences that like can be specific to them.
Mhm.
And I was wondering if you were seeing any of that starting to come in theater.
In the theater, are we seeing an interest in audience-specific stories? I mean, certainly the entire move towards sort of immersive theater and thinking Sleep No More, or these sort of more environmental things, I think are the impetus behind those is more audience-driven stories. I'm a big fan of scripts. Like, playwrights write plays, and they're pretty good at it, and have been good at it for a very long time. And I think, you know, it will come as no surprise that maybe I'm a little old-fashioned in that I started this with a painting by Leonardo da Vinci. But I think there's a pitfall in that, right? Like, a well-crafted script is an amazing thing, and if you've done it right, you can bring a room of 300 or 1,400 or 3,400 people along with you on that journey. And I think the danger in the sort of idea that we can craft a story for every individual is like, can we do that well? Like, can we? I'm not so sure. And then, since I'm on my high horse, like, I'm a believer in live performance, right? And the humanity of a group of people in a room together, having an experience together, I think is like, you know, that is the new luxury, right? Like, that is going to, I think, in 5-10 years' time, that is going to be thought of as an incredible luxury. That human interaction. And sadly, it's becoming a luxury now. I mean, I look at what you pay to go to see a Broadway show now, and it's like, oh, shit, that's a luxury. So, yeah, I mean, that's my high horse. Yeah?
This is a great example of playing with shadow in content. But this is being presented presented to the audience as an LED
Right.
wall. So this is emissive light. How does that cause challenges for the lighting designer?
I think it does. It causes challenges. There's no question. I think that it is less difficult than it used to be. One of my great embarrassing learning experiences. Years ago, I was working with Ken Posner. We were lighting the opening number of 9 to 5, the musical, which was a relatively short-lived production, sadly. It was the first time there was a full-stage LED wall on Broadway. This was a number of years ago, and and we lit that number. We spent 3-4-hour sessions trying to light the number. Ken Posner is a pretty good lighting designer. he knows how to light a thing, and it looked terrible. It just constantly looked terrible. And he and the director were relighting it and relighting it and relighting it. They just couldn't figure it out. And then finally I realized, oh, it's my fault. And I then proceeded to take the LED wall and globally across the entire number, reduce it to 25% of its previous brightness. And all of a sudden, everything looked great. And you could actually see what Ken was doing. And you could understand where to look, because the backlight that he was hitting, the using to focus our attention was bright enough that you could understand how to move your eye around the stage. And I told Ken that I'd done this. I didn't tell anyone else. And after we ran it the next time and everyone said, oh, Ken, you fixed it, I just kept my mouth shut. Because, yes, I fixed it, but that's only because I'd been fucking it up for the last 12 hours. But what's interesting is I think those problems have changed. It's still a huge challenge. I walk into the room and I now, as a practice, will begin a technical rehearsal with the LED wall hard limited at usually about 10% of its possible output. Because there is now much dimmer LED product than there used to be, actually. And even it is probably an order of magnitude too bright. So like I'll walk in and sit in front of an Absen 2.5 or 2.6 wall with an output of 1400 nit, 1600 nit, something like that. And I'll be like, okay, we're gonna just bring all that down and we're only gonna use the bottom 30%. And it's probably still too bright. And so I think a lot of the problem about how you do that is, as a projection designer, you need to be looking at the lighting designer, and it's my job to accommodate. It's the exact flip of when I began, where we would turn on the projectors and it would be like, oh, here's my 10K projector trying to fill a full stage surface at the Metropolitan Opera, which is a ridiculous prospect. And then the lighting designers would all light down to whatever the brightness of the projectors was. And the inverse is now true. It is our job to bring what we're doing down to the level of what the lighting designer can accommodate. And then all of a sudden you're in this world where those depth illusions work, right? Because you're saying, oh, I am near black. I can manage all of this detail that an LED wall that's emissive stops looking emissive, right? Whereas I was like, oh no, that, like literally I can start fooling people into thinking that an LED wall is a painted surface with light falling on it. But that light falling on it is also a trick. Like, how is the light moving through the volume of space that is the stage? And how would it be bouncing up on this fake surface? So a lot of what I'm doing to create that illusion is spending a lot of time thinking about, well, oh, would the follow spot be bouncing off this shiny floor, and how am I going to deal with that? Or what color is the backlight? And if I want to create the illusion that that's the, the bright red floor that we have for chess is spilling up on that wall, I need to understand how light is moving through the room first. and work on manufacturing that illusion. But it is much more possible if you just don't turn it to 11. And it is exciting then, I mean, to then turn it to 11. Yes?
Peter, talking about the virtual set versus the physical set,
Yeah.
how do you feel that affects audience perspective if they're looking at a flat screen that is portraying depth versus physical objects that are portraying depth in reality?
Oh, you caught me out. So the question was about, so for those following on at home, about how does an audience respond to a virtually simulated depth versus real depth. Literally until today, I would have forsworn any notions of like creating illusionistic depth in content. Like, it's why I'm generally a little allergic to using 3D modeling to create virtual environments that you're putting on stage, because I don't think it works generally. Like that mixture of like real physical space and simulated physical space, I rarely find convincing. And so I think the answer is you either have to completely sell it. It either has to be a viable illusion, or maybe you shouldn't do it. And of course, there's exceptions for this rule, but I think it's an important question of like, are you really creating a viable illusion? A lot of the work, like what we just did on Hell's Kitchen, has been born out of a number of years of work that we've done translating Broadway productions for the Tonys, right? So that the set for the Tonys is basically a bunch of LED legs and an upstage LED wall, and every show that's going to perform on the Tonys broadcast, usually it's the art directors from NBC who are CBS, anyways, the network. How about that? Who are doing that work? Who are doing the work of translating those things? But any show that I've designed, I usually do that translation work. So we've, for the last like 6, 7, 8 years, have been practicing how do you take a physical set, create it, recreate it, and have it manifest on an LED screen. It is so much easier to do on camera, let me tell you. It is a million times easier. However, that procedure is really what we did on Hell's Kitchen to all right, we're good, to create that illusion, and there I think it works. I think when you fail to create that illusion, you better I think then you need to own that, right? You need to like, okay, there is a context in which I'm presenting this. Either it is then very purposefully not illusionistic is the alternative. I think that place in the middle is really awkward. That's where you get into trouble. Yeah?
There, many years ago, we
Oh,
had
yeah.
a conversation about which was easier in After Effects or in the media server. Can you talk about your thoughts about how you choose your tools to solve the problems that you run into?
Sure, of course. The question was about building content, building designs on media servers or in After Effects. I mean, the short answer is yes. I mean, both, obviously. I think that what is, I look at now the way I work, and this is a great example of the way my studio works. This sort of storyboarding where we're building full models of the scenery in Cinema 4D. We're bringing that into After Effects. We can fully model all of the content on moving scenery in After Effects. Is our bread and butter. It is like the day-to-day process, but it only gets us so far, right? It's all still our imagination of what the stage picture is going to be. And you know, it makes pretty pictures, and it gets us to the first day of technical rehearsals, but it never gets us to the end. There always comes that moment where, like, now I'm in the room, and how are we gonna use all of this material that we've built up until this moment? And what I think the real advantage of the media service is speed, right? The speed at which we can do things in After Effects is so much slower and so much more cumbersome that the fact that I can sit down with a disguise programmer and cook something up sort of very rapidly with a stage in front of me is priceless. What then happens is sort of that happens, and then I spend the next whole part of the process undoing everything that's been done in the media servers. And we have a whole, in my studio, we have a whole process where like we can pull all the data back off Disguise and be like, oh, we were doing this hue angle adjustment, and we were doing this scale and this positioning and this blur. We were doing all these things in Disguise. We bring all that data back to my animators, and it all gets pulled back out of Disguise by the end of the process. I mean, not all of it. Some of it stays there, some of it doesn't. But I think it's about the right tool for the right moment, right? And I think what's critical to those things is a lot of people have argued, why do we do all this insane work storyboarding in After Effects? Why aren't we just jumping straight to Disguise? And part of the answer is that while some of the 3D modeling and rendering in a Disguise user interface is technically accurate, what it isn't is accurate to the end result of our experience. Right? It doesn't do a good job of sort of like impressionistically fooling us into thinking this is what the picture's going to be like. If you look at some of Melziner's early watercolor renderings, he designed all of the original Tennessee Williams. Those watercolor renderings don't look like the set. Like, they really don't look like the set. But what they did is they conveyed a feeling, right? And so that the idea that we're storyboarding and we're coming up with these ideas in a technically accurate environment isn't always the best tool for the job. And so when we're in the studio, in a content production environment, the fact that these storyboards are happening like as we're building the content, we can be looking, and After Effects is busy showing us that storyboard in real time. That feedback is helpful, and our ability to kind of be more impressionistic is helpful. Then we get into the theater, and what is the fastest tool to prototype? It's Disguise, right? And so then that's the right tool at that moment. And then I'd like the blurs to be better. I would like the color processing to be better. But that's not a criticism. It's like, yeah, I mean, well, okay, but no, like, I mean, there's a reality is that, like, if you've got a Disguise server that I'm expecting to render at 60 frames a second, whatever I can throw at the timeline, as opposed to, a render farm where they're taking 1.5 minutes per frame, okay, maybe if you take 1.5 minutes to render the frame, it's going to look better, but you can't do that in real time, so that's the sort of struggle that we're constantly in, and it feels like it makes a lot of extra work, but I haven't figured out a better plan yet, so. Yeah, way in the back.
This may need to be the last question.
Okay.
Hi, sorry for redesigning your lights earlier.
Oh, that's all right.
I had a question about like sort of tools for different times. Like, whereas LEDs might be really great for more reductive depth, like when do you see opportunities to deploy more like projection mapping as more additive?
I love projectors. Projectors are the best. And LED is sort of like, okay, if we must. I feel that less and less now that LED is getting better and better. There was a long time when I wouldn't even use it because I was just like, well, that looks horrible. In the end, I like both. Like, those two things together are amazing because you solve the shadow problem, you have something emissive and you do all that, and then to be able to layer projection on top of it is fantastic. And so that, like, that's the best of all worlds, and that's like on Hell's Kitchen, on MJ, on a lot of the things I've done, it's about a front projection layer and a LED layer and combining those two things. What I think is magical about projection is that it is volumetric light. You're aware of it being light moving through a volume of space, which gives it a sort of humanity that I think is really critical to live theater. You're aware of light falling on real objects, right? Like, there's nothing I like more than a projector pointed at a piece of plywood painted black, like, because you get all the grain of the plywood, you get all that texture, and that it is so hard to put that texture into an image on an LED wall. I mean, it's so boring, but I spent so much time trying to do that. Like trying to make LED walls human, and projectors with scenery, not screens, but projectors and projected light falling on real objects just does it naturally. It's just easier. So I'm a huge fan. It's the short answer. I believe that means we're out of time,
Yes, thank you
but
so
I will be
much.
wandering around. You're welcome to corner me if you'd like. And